Hello there and welcome back. This is Jennifer. I took a little time off there to kind of catch up on some things and kind of rest. So I'm back now with a video. Now this is the first of two videos showing a fun way to do a resist technique that results in two cards, one that's bold and then one that is soft. I love techniques like this. Now in this first video, I'll share two different ways to do this technique, and in my video tomorrow, I'll share two more ways. And I really hope you tune in for that second video because one of the inks you can use for this is a surprise. I was shocked that it worked, so I'm excited to share that. Now the cool thing is this works with a lot of basic supplies we have, so I'm hoping you all give it a try. Before we get started, I did want to give you a peek at the cards I'll have in my next video. Be sure to tune in for that because I show more ways to get this look with different inks. Let's get started with this pair of cards, one that's bold and one that's soft. Now for this technique, you will need some solid stamps. It could be any shape. It could be cling, wood-mounted, or clear. I decided to use the new Simon Says stamp, Build a Plaid Cling Stamp. I like that these are different size stripes and it works great for this technique, but say you have a large clear heart, that would work. In my next video, I'll use some clear stamps that are shapes to demonstrate that. But in this video, I'm focusing on using these stripes. Now, rubber always has stamped better than clear. That's just the nature of it. Stamping started with red rubber, and so these will stamp brilliantly. I do have some clear stripe sets. You could definitely use that, but today I'm using these cling stamps because they'll stamp beautifully. I'm also using the Simon Says stamp, Holiday Stems and Berries background stamp. This is, I think, meant for holiday, but it could definitely be used all year round. Any kind of background stamp will work for this, even other stamps, which you'll see as we go. Now I'm just stamping this with Hero Art's Unicorn White Pigment ink onto white cardstock. Any white cardstock would work. White pigment ink is an essential ink that I think all crafters should have. It definitely can be used for a lot of techniques, including the one we're doing today. Since my ink pad needs to be re-inked, I'm just double stamping it to make sure I get a good impression. Now you won't really see that ink because it's white ink on white paper, but if you heat set it, you'll be good to go. Don't worry about it at all. What I think a lot of us forget is that white pigment ink will resist dye ink that you put on top. So today we're going to do a fun resist with that ink on regular white cardstock. It's amazing how well it works. And we're going to stamp off the excess ink onto another piece for a lighter version. So let's get started. First, these are the colors of dye ink I'll be using for this technique. Any dye ink will work. I'm using Pinkfresh Studio inks on this card just because I like the bright colors. So in my Misty stamping tool, I have that white cardstock where we have already stamped the background stamp with white pigment ink. Now I'm positioning one of the solid stripes on top. Any solid image would work here. Once I have it positioned, I will stamp on top of our white pigment ink stamped cardstock with a colorful dye ink. So what happens is when I stamp on this, you'll see the white pigment ink on our white cardstock will resist some of this ink we're stamping on top. Now I'm just setting this aside and moving on to another piece of white cardstock that has nothing on it. It's a blank white cardstock piece, and I'm stamping the excess ink on that. And look at the resist from the first piece will stamp off on the second piece. Now I want this to be more intense, so I'm repeating the process. Inking up my stamp with the purple dye ink, stamping it on top of our white pigment ink. Then I'll move that out of the way and stamp the excess ink off onto a piece of plain white cardstock. So now I can go back to the first one, and wherever there was white pigment ink stamped on this first one, we can wipe away some of the purple ink on top. So I just use a dry cloth and I just wipe right across that stamped image. And that just kind of removes the excess ink that might be sitting on top of the white pigment ink. So the white pigment ink on this kind of resisted the ink and left it on the stamp. So we were able to stamp that leftover ink onto the second piece over there on the right. So we're having a bold image and a soft image. So let's do this again. Again, this is the piece of cardstock that has the white stamping on it. I'm lining up my next solid stamp. And I will ink this up with a dye ink. I do recommend darker dye inks for this. I find the second generation or the next piece will be much better if you use a darker ink. So I stamp that on top of our white pigment ink stamped image, move that out of the way, and stamp the leftover ink on the stamp onto a piece of plain white cardstock. And look at that. Isn't that cool? Now I do find it's best to double stamp it. You do not have to, but double stamping it makes it more intense. So I'm repeating that process. I'll take this out of the way, stamp off all that extra ink onto this one, and look at how beautiful that is. You can definitely see the pattern in both. Now I'm going back to that first one and wiping the excess ink off. The excess ink that's sitting on top of the white pigment ink will wipe away a little bit just to intensify it. Now you can see that the white pigment ink stamped on the left doesn't completely resist it. It just makes it softer, which I think is a great subtle resist technique. Resist has been around a long time in the stamping world. A resist technique is just where you stamp on something on top of something and it resists the ink you're stamping on top. In this case, the white pigment ink is resisting the dye ink that we're stamping on top. But instead of just wiping that stamp clean, I'm stamping that second generation on a second piece, so we end up with two backgrounds, one that's very bold and one that's soft. And in both, you can definitely see that first background stamp that we used with the white pigment ink. So this is a technique that can be done in many ways. I've shown it before where you stamp with white pigment ink, and then you add dye ink over a stencil, or just dye ink over the entire background with ink blending. You can do whatever you want, but in this case, you end up with two backgrounds. So you could use a solid heart, a solid circle, solid stripes like this. It can be a cling stamp, clear stamp, or rubber stamp. It doesn't matter. Now the first image I did with white pigment ink in this case was a background stamp. Remember that berries background stamp? You could do individual stamps and just stamp it repeatedly with white pigment ink. You can do whatever you want. And I do have more examples for you in this video and the next. And I'm using different inks for the resist in all of them. Okay, so here I'm doing double stamping. So I'm doing a darker purple thin stripe on top of the medium purple stripe I've already done. Now, the second generation doesn't really show up on the second piece, but it does on this one. So it's up to you if you want to take that excess ink off to the other one or not. But I did found if I am layering up stripes like I'm doing here, it really only shows up on the first generation, which is this piece, and not so much on the second generation where we stamp off the extra ink. But for that first solid image, you definitely can use that extra ink on a second background. Okay, so I'm going to continue to stamp more stripes until I'm happy with the background that I have. And then I will end up with two backgrounds, one that's very bold, the one you're looking at here, and one that's very soft, which is the second generation. I really appreciate techniques like this because it allows you to create two backgrounds at once and therefore two cards at once. One is very bold and one is very light, so they do look very different. And I will do a different card design with each of them. If you do not own a white pigment ink, I definitely recommend getting one. I usually use the Hero Arts Unicorn white pigment ink that I'm using here, or the Ink on 3 Shark Tooth white pigment ink, but you could use any of them. I know there are white pigment inks from Simon Says Stamp, Gina Kane Designs, and many others. They all would work well for this. So now we have the first generation resist on the left, and then the softer second generation on the right. Now, after we turn these backgrounds into cards, I'm going to show you another way to do this resist technique. But this one with the white pigment ink, I think works best with any background stamp or individual stamps. It doesn't matter if they have solid areas like the leaves on this background stamp did, or if they had thin lines. It doesn't matter. They all work really well with the white pigment ink used as the resist. But I'll show you another one in a moment, but let's turn these into cards. I trimmed down both of my backgrounds to be 4 by 5 1/4 inches. One I decided to make horizontal and one I'll make vertical. That's the nice thing about this technique. You can just do whatever you want with each of the backgrounds and get two very different looks if you prefer. However, if you do want to save time, you could do this exact same card design with both of the backgrounds, just one would be a little bit softer than the other. Okay, so here are the two backgrounds I have. One will be vertical and one will be horizontal. I love the results here. You can definitely see the background stamp on both of them, even though we only stamped it on the piece on the right. But it's very subtle. Let's get started with the bold background first. Now for the sentiment there that says joy, I used a gold cardstock. Now this is a new gold cardstock from Simon Says Stamp. It's a nice matte gold. There's also silver. I like that it's matte, so it's not too shiny. But I actually have them stored in the new Simon Says Stamp paper sleeves. Now I use job ticket holders in the past for my cardstocks, but this is a really nice option. You can see how there's a little cut towards the top so you can easily grab the cardstock out of it. Also, the edges are sealed very nicely so that they won't tear. So if you're looking for a paper or cardstock storage option, this is definitely a good one, and I'll talk about them more in future videos. First, I need to buy a lot more of them. I also wanted to mention that Simon Says Stamp now has these large plastic pockets that are super durable. Again, they have a nice strong seal around the sides. These remind me of the ones that I use for die pockets. You can see here in my hands now, they're the square ones I normally store my dies in. They're a little bit wider than those and taller, so you could actually put a stamp set in here if you want, a normal 4x6 stamp set. But I'm going to be using it mostly to store my dies because the seals and the edges are stronger. There is a little flap on the top that you can tuck in. I like putting my dies in these stronger pockets because they don't tear. So again, will talk more about these in a future video, but I wanted to let you know about them now. I'm going to buy some more of them so I can do a video on them, so stay tuned. Now for my greeting, in addition to the large die cut gold joy word, I'm using a sentiment strip from Simon Says Stamp. To do a sentiment strip, these are pre-printed. I just want to cut out one sentiment. So I cut along one edge, like I did just there. Now I take a piece of large scrap cardstock. I had this gold on hand, and I line up the straight edge of the cardstock with the straight edge of my blade. So it's right there flush with it. I then take the rest of my sentiment strip and tuck it underneath that cardstock, and I line it up so that my sentiment strip hangs out just perfectly. You can see how that sentiment sticks out there from the gold. Once I'm happy with where it's positioned, I just cut right along it, and I know that that will cut out my sentiment just right, so I have the nice spacing above and below it. So you can see the positioning is just right there. Now I can save that gold cardstock for something else. And then I just trim off the excess on the left and the right, and there we have our sentiment strip, positioned just right. Okay, so I did die cut the word joy from gold cardstock, and then the shadow for that from white cardstock. And this is the die set I use for that. It's new from Simon Says Stamp, and it's called Large Joy. So I glued the gold joy die cut onto the white die cut shadow, and I added that to our card. I want the sentiment strip to be over the bottom of the Y, but there's some dimension there. So what I did is I put pencil lines on the back of the sentiment strip, just to the left and the right of the Y. That way I know where I need to add some extra dimension so that it'll stand up even with the word joy. So I'm putting some liquid adhesive to one side of the pencil, and I'm adding a thin white cardstock strip there. Now you could use foam tape here, but I like using layered pieces of white cardstock because that way it'll be more sturdy. So I glued 2 to the back of that side. Then I'll put glue on the other side of the pencil, and I'll add 2 strips over there. So there are 2 strips of white cardstock on the back of the sentiment strip, everywhere except that little section in the middle where we're going to put this on top of the Y. Okay, so now I'm putting glue onto those areas, and then I will add that over our joy die cut. This way everything is flush and it'll go through the mail nicely. One last thing I wanted to do is stamp an envelope to match this card. So I have a light pink envelope from Simon Says Stamp, and I'm masking off the front of the card so only the back flap will be showing. I put that into my Misty stamping tool. I line up that same background stamp that we used for the white pigment ink resist, and I'll stamp on the envelope flap with white pigment ink. This will be very subtle on this light color envelope, but I think that's what you want for your envelope, so it'll match nicely. Little touches like this make a handmade card even more special. Now our inked panel, I did add onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch purple note card, and I added a white cardstock piece on the inside to write our personal message. I also added some Trinity Stamps gold baubles here and there on the background to match the gold matte cardstock from Simon Says Stamp that we used for the word joy. So here you can see that beautiful background that's very subtle behind those bold stripes. It's a continuous pattern because we used that background stamp with the white pigment ink as a resist. So this is the first card, the bold version. We still have the softer background left to turn into a card. Now for this one, I used the Simon Says Stamp Thanksgiving die set. This is a new one. So you can cut the piece that you see on my left hand there that is a shadow for the word thanks and also the word giving. Then there is the word thanks, which is another die in the set that you can layer on top. So this die set can be used in many ways, but I just used the word thanks on this card. I like a die set that can be used for multiple occasions. Now in this case, I trimmed that background down and added it to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch black note card. That's Hero Art's pitch black cardstock. I also added a white cardstock insert on the inside to write my personal message. I die cut that thanks die from the Thanksgiving die set from black cardstock and glued that on the front and stamped From All of Us underneath it with black ink. You can see the background is much softer than our first version because we used the leftover ink or the second generation for this background. By the way, that little sentiment that I stamped here that says From All of Us, it's from this new Simon Says Stamp XL Christmas Greeting stamp set. I will use this stamp set again in my next video, so stay tuned for that. It's a great set that covers a lot of different styles for different holiday cards. Now remember at the beginning how I said I'd be sharing 2 different variations of this technique in today's video? Well, before we move on to the second variation, I wanted to do another example of this white pigment ink resist because it works so well. So let's do another pair of cards. I have already stamped the same background stamp that I used on my last example with white pigment ink onto white cardstock. And I heat set it so it's all dry. That's the piece I have here in my Misty stamping tool. I am again starting with one of the bold stripes and stamping on top of it with a dye ink. These are the colors of dye ink I'm using this time. Most are from Pink Fresh Studio once again, but I threw in one from Gina K also. This is Sea Glass. So I ink up my stamp with a dye ink and stamp it on top of our white pigment ink stamping. Then I stamp off the excess ink onto another piece of white cardstock. This is the same process I did before. I like to really intensify this, so I'm repeating the process again with the same color of ink in the same spot. Always be sure to wipe the excess ink off of your white pigment ink background. That way the white pigment ink will pop a little bit more so you can see more of your background stamp. Here I'm coming in with another. This time I am overlapping my stripes. The advantage of overlapping the stripes is in the area where it overlaps, you get a new color. So here I'm doing the same process. And notice that third color that's popping up there where you overlap. I only used 2 colors of ink, but it looks like I used 3 because I overlapped. In the first examples, I left a little bit of white space between. I just wanted to show you could do either. So there you can see what our 2 backgrounds are looking like already. I do think this is something I forget to do often, and maybe you do too, and that is to stamp 2 different colors on top of each other to create another color. It's a great way to get more from the colors of ink that you have. Now in this case, it just helps to create this fun resist background. So you can do resist with many different inks, and I'm going to demonstrate another one soon. But the advantage that we're doing here is that we're stamping the excess ink off onto another piece to get that soft look. So I skipped ahead a little bit here just to kind of move things along. This time I used the Gina K Sea Glass ink. You'll see in the first generation it's pretty bright, but on the second generation it's very light. So I ended up doing that one 3 times just so it would show up more on that last generation. So I do recommend using bolder colors for this technique so that your second generation, that extra piece that we're doing, shows up a bit more. So here I'm going back and adding a few stripes that overlap with the original one. That way we can build up lots of layers here, and it looks like we used even more colors of ink than we really did. So remember, you can always overlap 2 different colors to create a new one. Okay, let's get started with the bold version first. I covered the entire cardstock piece to create a bold background. On top of that, I used the new Simon Says Stamp Laurel Leaves background die. This cuts a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch frame, and I thought this would look great in white cardstock on top of our colorful background. I die cut 2 of those backgrounds from white cardstock and glued them together for a stacked look. Now I'm putting adhesive on the back of these. This is Gina K Connect Liquid Adhesive. I'm putting it in the corner of my Misty stamping tool. I then am taking my stamped background, which I trimmed down, and gluing it on top. The reason I'm doing this in the corner of my stamping tool is I can be sure that I make sure the frame is squared. We want to make sure that it's not glued down like at a little bit of a warp. You want it to be squared. So you can push up against the corner and the edges of the Misty to make sure it's squared up. Okay, so now all we need to do here is add a sentiment. I'm using an older one. This is from Simon Says Stamp and CZ Design. It's the Thanks die. I die cut the word thanks from the silver matte cardstock I showed you earlier. I wanted it to be a bold blue color, so I'm coloring it with my Copic markers. This is a great way to create your own colored foil cardstock. Just add Copic markers or alcohol inks, and you can have whatever color you want. This also works with glitter cardstock, gems, and pearls. You can make them whatever color you want with anything permanent like a Copic marker or alcohol inks. Now, once I gave that a little time to dry, I added the blue Thanks foil cardstock onto a white die cut shadow. Remember, there was a shadow die included in the die set. I then added a Hugs from Afar from a Simon Says Stamp sentiment strip. And then in the background, I scattered some blue pearls from Studio Katia. So this is a really simple design. After you do the stamping, the resist stamped background, you can just add the die cuts on top and you're good to go. I love that bold background with the subtle resist that we created with the white pigment ink. Okay, now let's do our softer background. This was the one where we stamped off that excess ink. Now for this, I used one of my favorite all-time die sets. I've used this more than any other. It's a Simon Says Stamp Big Thanks. It has the word thanks and its shadow. I'm also using the Simon Says Stamp Fine Petal Leaves Branch die set. This is a new one, and there are 2 dies in there, and I'll use the larger. So I have a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card, and I'm gluing our soft inked background at a little bit of an angle towards the top left corner. This is my go-to design. When I'm not sure what to do with a background, I kind of glue it at this little angle off to the side, and then I add a sentiment and another accent die cut. I think this is my go-to design because it allows a lot of that inked background to show, but it's a little interesting too. Okay, so I'm using the Petal die that I showed you, and I cut it 3 times from white cardstock. Now this die cuts like layers to the petal, so I am gluing them together so the outside layers are glued directly together and the inside layers have foam tape between them to give some dimension. It's kind of hard to describe, but when you look at it closely here when the card is done, you'll be able to see it. I just like to add dimension every chance I get because it adds so much interest to the card. This will require a little extra postage, but it's definitely worth it in my eyes because of the interest you add to make the card more special. So I added that onto our card, and I also have our thanks. I die cut the thanks from Hero Art's blue lapis cardstock, and then the shadow die from white cardstock, and I glued those together and added it on top. I also stamped a sentiment under the word thanks from a stamp set that I'll show you in a moment, and I did that with a blue ink from Pink Fresh Studio that matched my cardstock. So you can see how the background is continuous because of the resist technique we did. All we did here was stamp off our extra ink onto plain white cardstock, and we were able to create this really beautiful, soft background. I love techniques that allow you to create 2 for 1, and this is definitely one of the best. By the way, the sentiment that says you make life beautiful is from this older Simon Says stamp, You Got This stamp set. Okay, time for our next pair of cards, and this offers a variation of this resist technique. Instead of using white pigment ink, we're using white embossing. This gives a more impactful result and works great with any fine line stamps. Once again, I'm starting with just plain white cardstock. I'm using an anti-static powder tool first because we'll be doing heat embossing. I have the new Simon Says stamp Geometric Snowflake background die. This has fine lines to it and works great for this technique. I'm inking it up generously with Versamark ink, and then I will stamp it onto our white cardstock. Once I'm sure I've stamped it well, I will add white embossing powder to it. So we'll have a white heat embossed image on white cardstock. It'll be subtle, but shows up more than the last time where we used white pigment ink. This will show up a bit more because of the shine that embossing powder gives. Any embossing powders would work for this technique. I do think white embossing looks most impactful, but you could use clear, silver, gold, whatever you have. Okay, so now it's time to stamp with a solid image and dye ink on top of that white embossing. Last time the white pigment ink was the resist. This time it's white embossing. So I'm inking this up with a dye ink. I'm using the same greens that I used on the last example. I stamp that on top of our white embossed image, set that aside and grab a clean piece of white cardstock with nothing on it and stamp the excess ink, just like we did last time. Okay, back to the first one. I'm stamping this again. You don't have to stamp it twice. I chose to do so just to make it darker and more intense. So I inked it up with the same green ink, stamped right on top of that, then bring in that second piece, which has nothing on it except for this leftover ink that we bring on top. So there you can see that's building a beautiful pattern, even though there was nothing stamped on it first. It's just the second generation, the leftover ink. Then you can wipe the excess off of your heat embossing because the ink kind of sits on that embossing. So you want to wipe it away. Okay, now coming in with our next stripe and putting that right next to the last one. You could make this overlap or have a little space between, totally up to you. Now the difference between this version and the version we did before is this first darker or bolder image will be more intense. You can see how the stamping stays true white because we did white embossing. On the last example, it was a little more subtle resist because we did stamping with dye ink or colored ink on top of white pigment ink. So this is more of an intense resist. You can do whichever you want. It really doesn't matter. Play around with it and figure out which you like best. I will say, if you want to use a detailed stamp, like this detailed background stamp, I recommend doing this form of resist with the white pigment ink. If you have a background that has a little more solid area to it, like the leaves did on the berry stamp we used last time, I recommend using white pigment ink. The reason I recommend only using detailed images with this white heat embossing version is because when you stamp on top of the white embossing, it really resists it. That ink sits on top. So when you go to your second generation version, it looks a little more splotchy. But both really give great results. They both work with the resist, and the stamping on top with dye ink is the same. So I encourage you to try both and see which works best for you with whatever stamps you have. Okay, so I have two backgrounds now. This one's bold, and then we have the second one, which is much lighter. And so I'm able to create two cards from this technique. I love that they give a very different feel. The first one's very bold and geometric looking. The second one's a little bit softer. Okay, so now let's start with the softer background. I use the Simon Says stamp Delicate Leafy Branch. It's a new one, a new favorite of mine. I die cut it 3 times from white cardstock and glued it onto our background. I then used the Simon Says Stamped Script Thanks die set. It's an older one I've used many times. I die cut the shadow from white and the word thanks from a really dark green cardstock and glued those together and onto our background. Here's a closer look. I did add some Trinity Stamps Something New white pearls just for a bit of dimension. I love that soft background and that you're able to see that geometric snowflake pattern even though we didn't stamp it on this panel at all. I also added a little sentiment strip under the word thanks that says so very much. That is white heat embossed on dark green cardstock. I think I forget to use dark colors of cardstock instead of black, and sometimes it's just perfect, like here with the dark green. The So Very Much is from this Simon Says Stamp Furry Friends 6x8 stamp set. I use the sentiments in this a lot, and that So Very Much works really well with the thanks die that we used. Now for the more solid background or the more vibrant background, I kept it very simple. I used the Simon Says Stamp Stylized Holy Star die, and I cut that from silver cardstock and white. I also used a simple sentiment from the Simon Says Stamp Reverse Sentiment Strips, and I'll link those below. It says Joyful Christmas, and I glued that right on top of our star. I did create this card to be a little narrow. It's 3 3/4 inches wide, 5.5 inches tall. So I took a regular envelope and cut a little bit off the bottom and then resealed it with my glue. This way, the envelope would be a little more snug on this slightly narrow card. You don't have to do this. You could just put it in the regular A2 envelope if you wanted to, but I like it to fit a bit better. And then you can just use regular postage with it. Okay, now I did add a little sparkle to this using some silver gemstones from Lucy's cards at the tips of the stars. You can see it there. It adds a bit of shine. But this is a very simple design. Again, it's 3 3/4 inches by 5.5 inches. I love the bold color with those bold white lines that we got with the white embossing powder. You can see how the white lines stand out more on this than it did in our first example where we did resist with the white pigment ink. That's a little more subtle. So if you want it to stand out more, use white embossing. If you want it to be more subtle, use white pigment ink. So those are 2 ways you can use resist to create a pair of cards, one bold and one soft. And remember to come back for my next video, which will be tomorrow, and it'll show yet 2 more ways to do this 2-for-1 resist technique with different inks. And I think one of them will surprise you. So this is just another way to get more from your supplies and create new looks. If you're interested in the supplies, they are linked below in my YouTube description, but you can also go to my blog where there is a lot more information and you can bookmark cards to save for future reference. Here in the middle, I have a couple other related videos with similar techniques. I thank you for spending all this time with me. I hope you found it valuable, and I'll see you again soon with more ideas.